On this channel, we talk a lot about gear and making music with gear. This video is going to be a little different. We're going to talk about the gear behind the gear, all of those support things that it takes to make these things connect and work properly together. We're going to talk about the three main signal chains: audio, MIDI, and power, and how I manage all of those signal chains within my live performance setup. There's going to be three sections to this video. We're going to talk about the audio signal path, the routing of each of the machine's audio signals, gain staging along the way, and what I do to the master output in order to make it sound exactly the way I want. Next, we're going to talk about the MIDI signal chain, what machines control what machines are running independently, and how they all know to stay in time and what controls that time. And then finally, we're going to talk about power management, about how to manage the power supplies for all of these different machines, including a really cool power management tool that's great for managing multiple pieces of gear with fewer power supply cables and power strips. Time to check out what's under the hood and see the gear behind the gear. All right, so first things first, let's talk about the audio signal path. I'm just gonna move this a little so you can see how the controllers work here. So first and foremost, we have a couple of things run through other things to get to the Octatrack, which is the central mixer of everything for audio. So we have the audio out, coming out from the Swarm here, and it's going into the audio input in the Syntac. You can run audio through the Electron machines, and so this is coming through. There is a control in here that controls the input volume, and also controls delay and reverb send on whatever you have coming into this. So I've got the Swarm coming in through here, uses its own spring reverb that's inside, but then there's also a secondary reverb and a delay here that I can use to add more effects to the signal that's coming out of the Swarm. Then from there, the audio is joined with the audio that's coming from inside the Syntac, and that's running out the left and right outputs and coming across to the C and D inputs in the Octatrack, which I usually call the right side. And a lot of these effects are set up to work left side, right side. So on the right side, I have everything that is melodics, so Swarm and the Syntac, and those are coming into the right side here in inputs C and D. Then that output is routed through a track within the Octatrack, and then a secondary neighbor track so that different effects can be added to that. And then those tracks are then routed through three recording buffers that are set up to listen to what's going on, so that I can record 4-bar loops and I can use those to transition within my set. And then track 8 on the Octatrack is set up as a master track for master effect. So that's the path of the melodic side. Next, we have everything that is drums and percussion and effects. So the 1010 black box, which does vocal samples and atmospheric kind of background droney stuff, that is run very much the way the Swarm is run through the Syntac, except that's run into the Digitac. So there's a stereo out coming from this into the stereo left and right input in the Digitac, and again there is a master volume for that and a delay and a reverb that I can use. That signal again joins with the signal from inside the Digitac, which is where I do all of my drums and percussion at the moment. Those come out and those go into the left side, so inputs A and B in the Octatrack. One thing that's really important with the signal path all the way through here with audio is gain staging, meaning having the gain and the volume levels so that we're not going to overload the signal anywhere in the chain, so that the output is going to be a clean output that can go through our final processing and out to the mixer. And because of that, I like to have certain levels preset so that I know where they are. So the Swarm, the level here and that external input of the Swarm is set so that I can turn this all the way up to maximum, and I know it's not gonna overload and it's not gonna clip, and it's not gonna be more dominant than the other melodic sounds that are coming from here. I put this at maximum and then I use this to mix with the others. I can still take it down from there all the way down to 0, but I know that if I max it out, it's only going to get to a certain level. And then with the two Electron boxes, I have the main master volumes of the two set at 50%. So I know that that's my kind of clean level. I can boost or bring it down a little bit from there, but that's basically the level where I want these to. And I will mix the sounds on these as I set up different banks of sounds. I mix the volume levels of each of the sounds so that they work at this 50% level. And then I can make any adjustments that I need to when I'm performing. As far as controlling the volume levels on the black box, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we go through the MIDI section, because they're controlled by a controller. But the volume on the black box going through the Digitact is set very much the same way, so that I know that I can max this out without ever having to overload the signal that's coming out of the Digitact into the Octatrack. As kind of a final step within this, the Octatrack has these little lights here that show you kind of the signal strength coming in from left and right, and it's a good indicator on this. You can see that it will switch from green to red as you get to kind of clipping or overloaded. So if you ever see that when you're doing this, that's kind of the cue to be able to adjust down whichever side is the side that's overloading. Then once the audio signals come into the Octatrack is set up as a performance mixer, so that all of these scenes down here are different effects. And this is actually a template that was made by another YouTuber, a guy called EasyBot. I'll link in the description down below. You should definitely check this out, because it completely revolutionized the way I play my live setup is by using this. All of these different effects are really useful for transitioning and building tension and releasing tension and doing breaks and build-ups and things like that. So that's all part of that audio signal path as well. So this is being used for live looping, mixing of all of the audio that's coming through, as well as effects processing of all of the audio from both channels here. Then from the Octatrack, the main out comes out of this and goes into the Electron analog heat. And what this does is it's basically like having a hardware mastering chain on the end of my setup before this goes out to the house mixer for a live performance, or out to my mixer in my studio for recording a performance here. The settings on this, you can kind of set it up to have your own presets, and the preset that I have set up here has saturation, which is kind of the second level of kind of overdrive. It goes way higher than that, but I just wanted some subtle saturation to add some power to the overall signal. Then you've got the drive at about 50%. There's kind of a 2-band equalizer here. Low is not doing anything right now, and I'll explain why in just a second. And the high is boosted just a little bit because we boost the lows using a filter, and this needed to be set there to kind of even out the lows and the highs, because we wanted some extra boost in power in the low end, but it was really overpowering the high end. So I boost up the highs here just a little bit. The key to the low end power is here in the filter section. So we have a high pass filter, which I've talked about in a couple of other videos. Is a great way to get some extra power in the low end of your kick drums and your subs and things like that. So it's a high pass filter where the frequency is brought way down, down in like the 21 hertz range. So you're not really cutting off anything that you would hear anyway. But then when you give it a boost of resonance, it gives it that peak of resonant boost right before the cutoff, which ends up being between 30 and 50 hertz, which is right about where you want to have your power from your kick and your sub. So this gives a low end boost. We also add in some high end with it in order to balance it out, and then some overall saturation. And that's kind of like the mastering on the end of the full signal chain, and then out from this out to the house system or to the recorder. And that's pretty much it for the audio chain. If you're enjoying this video and you're getting something positive out of it, I would really appreciate if you could give it a like down below. It makes the algorithm happy, and it pushes this out to a few more people, which really helps the channel. Now let's talk about MIDI. I've done a couple of other videos on this channel that you can check out after this one about routing MIDI and how I set up my setups in the past, and using through boxes and splitters and MIDI mergers and things like that to be able to get the signal to do everything I wanted. What I tried to do with this setup was to clean all of that up so that I didn't need any of those external devices. So I'm not using any mergers or any through boxes or anything in this system. So the way the MIDI signal path goes is I have it coming out from the Octatrack. I actually prefer using the Digitact as the main clock and brain. It's a bit more stable, but in this setup, I wanted to be able to control everything, start and stop and all of that from this centerpiece. So I've been using Midi out of here, and I really haven't had any problems with that recently. So Midi comes out from this and into the Digitact. Then you have a Midi through, which passes that signal through from the Digitact to the Syntact, to the Midi in. And then you have Midi through from the Syntact, which is going into the 1010 black box. Then the black box has a clock out, not just a Midi out, but an old school clock out to send clock signal. So that clock out is coming from the black box and into the clock in on the Swarm. And so what that does is it allows everything in here to be controlled by the Octatrack. I generally wouldn't daisy chain as much together as this, but it has been working really well. So I'm thinking that this is a stable enough system for what I'm doing. I don't have Midi going to the analog heat because I'm not using any of the LFOs or anything like that. I'm really just using that as an end of chain master and not any kind of the effects or any of that it can do. It does way more than what I'm using it for, but in this setup, I'm using this just as an end of chain master. So that's how the hardware is routed. The signal itself, start stop, comes from the Octatrack. So press start, everything goes and it stays in time, which is great. But beyond that, I don't have any of the machines controlling any of the other machines, because with the improvised sets that I like to play, it's actually better for me to have the flexibility of each machine using its own sequencer. So the drums are sequenced on the Digitact, the melodics are sequenced on the Syntact, and the Swarm has this 8-track internal sequencer, and the patterns that I do on this fall into that as well. So I can change this up very easily just by adding or removing steps. So I'm playing the sequencer during the performance, just like you might play a keyboard. And the black box isn't set up with any sequences at all in the way I'm using it. It can sequence and it can do a whole lot more again, but I'm just using this for time stretched longer samples, mostly vocals and some kind of background ambient drones and stuff like that. So there aren't any sequences running within here. These are set up almost the way you would set up clip launching in Ableton. So I can set off a vocal, I can trigger that, and it will loop in time with the rest of the system rather than sequencing things here. Now, the only piece of gear other than clock that's controlling anything else is the Launch Control XL is controlling the black box. So there's 16 channels in each preset, and each one of those is set as a different clip that I would use at different times during the set. The Launch Control XL is set up to control volume and filter, both high pass and low pass, on each of those channels via Midi. So these 8 faders on the Launch Control are set up to control tracks 1 through 8, volume on the faders, and then this row of knobs controls high pass and low pass from the same knob. Then the middle row of knobs up here is the volume for tracks 9 through 16, and then high pass and low pass filters up above for each of those tracks as well. So it gives me volume and high pass, low pass filter control over each of the 16 tracks on here. And then through the audio signal over here, I also have the ability to add delay and reverb to any of those as well without having to dive into any menus. So I can leave it just on this clip launching screen and do everything else using external gear. One of the things that's really handy is that the black box has a USB host capability. So the Launch Control XL plugs directly into this. So I don't need a USB host box like I would if I was going to use this to control any of the Electron gear, because none of these have a USB host capability. They only have regular MIDI in. So in general, I would need to go from this to a USB host via USB, switch that to DIN MIDI, then go to a merger to merge it with the clock, and then out from that. So just to have this control one of these boxes, I would need 2 different MIDI manipulation boxes, one of them which requires a power supply. And with this, it's really handy because just with a USB cable, this is powered off of the power from the black box. So it's great. I didn't need any extra equipment for that. And that's pretty much everything with the MIDI signal chain. Last but not least, let's talk about power supply. When I first set this up, having a power cord with a brick for each one of the machines in here was not very practical. To show up somewhere and have all of those extra cables needing a multi-strip to be able to connect everything was not the cleanest way to do it all. So a piece of gear that I just added recently, a piece of kind of literally under the hood gear. If I take out the launch control, you can see it down here. And this is the Seox DC7 power supply. And basically what this does to control many of what's here with the right adapters, using 2 of the channels, you can then control with 2 channels one of the pieces of Electron gear, the smaller square ones. The Octatrack, this doesn't have enough power to power the Octatrack, so this has its own power supply. But this one is powering the Syntact, the Digitact, and the analog heat, all from these external supplies, and that's with 1 power cord. In addition to that, there is a USB 5-volt power jack in the Seox as well, and that's what's powering the USB power for the black box. So this piece of gear here with 1 plug going to 1 outlet is controlling 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces of gear. And then the Octatrack has its own power supply, and the Swarm has its own power supply, because both of these draw too much power for this to work for them. And until very recently, I had the Strymon Big Sky pedal as well as part of this, and there was 1 extra jack on the Seox, which had enough power to control the Big Sky as well. So that was actually a 5th piece of gear that was being controlled off of this 1 plug. What's great about this is that it allows me to minimize the amount of cables, minimize the amount of power supply that I need when I go somewhere. I can hook up 1 plug from this, 1 plug from each of these, so 3 plugs, and I'm ready to go. Everything powers up from there. The only drawback I would say to this power supply is that over time it does get really warm. I'm looking for a solution to ventilate this a little better. As you could see, I've got it kind of stuck down inside here and underneath the Launch Control XL, which is not really the best place. It works fine for playing a set, but I don't feel comfortable with how much it heats up once you get past about 3 or 4 hours. It gets to be a bit too hot, so I'm looking for another way to ventilate this a little bit better. But in the meantime, this has been working really, really great. And the way this power supply works is that each one of the channels puts out, depending on how you set these dip switches, it puts out a different voltage, DC voltage. And depending on the DC voltage that it's putting out, that determines how many milliamps that particular channel is putting out. So at 12 volts, which is what these machines all run off of, each one of these puts out 500 milliamps. And then with those 500 milliamps, if you use this adapter cable that you can get from the company here, you can actually combine 2 of those into 1 signal, and then that channel or that cable can go out to one of the boxes to power that. So you're getting 500 milliamps, 500 milliamps, you're getting 1 amp of power that's going out to the box, which is enough to power these machines. At least it has been so far. I know there's been some concern about whether or not this would power the Syntac. I haven't seen any issues with it at all, no matter what I've been running with this so far. I haven't had any shutdowns. I haven't had any issues with it starting up or anything like that. So this has been enough. I know that technically there's been some information online that the Syntax spikes to above 1 amp when it's switching on and at certain times when you're using it. But that hasn't been enough to be affected by the Seox. So this has been enough to work with this so far. And that 1 amp of output is plenty for the analog heat and the Digitact, and also for the Digitone if you happen to have one of those. 1 amp is more than enough to power those, and it's not enough for the Octatrack or the Swarm. And so I have those on their own power. I hope this helps to clarify just a little bit how everything's connected and how everything works. If you have any questions about anything that you saw today, more than happy to answer if I know the answer, and if not, I can maybe point you in the direction of somebody who knows it better than I do. If you enjoy this kind of content and you'd like to support the channel, there's a couple different ways you can do that. There's links down in the description below to my Patreon, and patrons get things like downloadable files of all of the live jams that I do and some sample packs and things like that. Or if you're thinking about buying any of this gear and you click on one of the affiliate links down below, that will also help to support the channel and at no additional cost to you. I really appreciate you choosing to spend some of your valuable time with me, and I hope you got something positive. Thanks again, and hope to see you in the next video. Until then, take care of each other.